Hey everyone, I'm Brian Parks. I hope you're doing well on this fine Thursday. Um, in this video, I want to talk about how I use Windows Subsystem for Linux. So I've done a couple videos on how to do specific things in Windows Subsystem for Linux. A lot of PHP stuff, some just general Linuxy stuff, and I'll leave a playlist of those linked in the description below and at the end of the video. But I wanted to kind of take a step back and show some of the ways that I actually do use Windows Subsystem for Linux and how I kind of got into it. Because to be honest, I came from a Mac background, a Linux background, and when I first used Windows Subsystem for Linux, I quite frankly didn't see the point. I felt like it was a solution to a problem that true Linux developers didn't really have. But the more I learned about it, the more I realized that there actually was a purpose for it. And if you use it the way that it works really well, I know that seems kind of weird why you shouldn't change how you work just to cater to a tool. But in this case, Windows Subsystem for Linux really does serve a purpose. And so I want to show that to you here. So let's jump into this is the Windows terminal. I watch a lot of Scott Hanselman's videos. Even some of his, some of the videos that he has that are geared toward beginners. It's always good to get kind of a refresher on some of the simple stuff that maybe I learned several years ago, but I kind of take for granted these days. It's always nice to get that refresher. But one of the things that he talks a lot about is the Windows terminal. So first, let me show what my settings are here, because I do use Windows Terminal for a bunch of different things, not just Windows Subsystem for Linux. So obviously, I do have Windows PowerShell, Command Prompt, PowerShell. I use the PowerShell core a lot. I used to use Git Bash because it was really good for especially Git stuff. But now my shell on Windows is pretty much almost exclusively PowerShell. You don't see Git Bash on my whatever this is taskbar at all. Usually it was a staple. I even had it pinned. Now I have the Windows terminal pinned because I do all that stuff through PowerShell core. And then of course WSL. And the specific thing I want to call your attention to is the starting directory. By default, when Windows Terminal installs and kind of picks up what's available for it to be the terminal for, it doesn't choose the starting directory. So it's nice to have it put you in your home directory. And that's what this is. So basically, WSL $ is a special, it looks kind of like a UNC share, but it's a kind of a special path that says, look for WSL stuff. Ubuntu 1804 is the WSL VM, if you want to call it that, that I'm using. And then inside of that, home bparks is my home directory. So that's my settings. I don't have anything fancy here. You can go look at Scott Hanselman's videos on how to trick out your Windows terminal. And he's got a bunch of videos on making PowerShell look pretty snazzy. I haven't done any of that, mainly because I'm lazy. But yeah, so that's basically what I have going on there. So when I get dropped into my WSL shell in Windows Terminal, obviously it's bash. It's dropping me in my home directory. If I do pwd, it'll show /home/bparks, which is what we expect. Now let me ls here. I've got a couple things. Usually I just have working. I was actually doing Go. I was trying to do some Go stuff in WSL. I think in my Go video, which I'll leave linked in the description as well, I don't think I ended up using Windows Subsystem for Linux. I might be misremembering, but that Go directory is where Go packages would go. And then NetBeans projects, that's because I did that video on can you run a full IDE in Windows Subsystem for Linux. NetBeans was the only one that actually worked, so that's a directory that it created. But you'll notice that working is actually a symlink. So if I do ls-ld working, you'll see it's actually a symlink to mntc users bpark working. It still frustrates me that Windows truncates my username, so my name is not Park, it's Parks, but because I signed in to this machine with my email address, which is bparks@brianparks.me, it just truncated it at 5 characters, and that's my username. But rant aside, basically this is a symlink to the Windows side. So my working directory, or my home directory on Windows, is cusers bpark, and then within that I have a directory that I call working, and that's where I put all my Git stuff. Now there are different schools of thought on this, that you should do either Linuxy stuff in Linux and Windowsy stuff in Windows, or yeah, I mean, that's basically the school of thought. Either do what I'm doing or keep the things separate. And the reason for that is because there are different features that are supported by Linux file systems versus Windows file systems that can lead to some squirrely things. For instance, you'll notice that this is showing as blue with a green background, indicating that that directory is basically has all permissions open to everybody. And that's not really the case. It's just that that's the way the Linux side sees the Windows directory. So what I do is I have one working directory. This makes it easy from my perspective for things like backups and stuff like that. So I have one directory that all of my Git repositories go into. It's called working. It's in my home directory. And I do that on all of my machines. So whether I have a Linux machine, a Mac machine, or my Windows machine here, my home directory /working, that's where that directory is. Makes it super easy. Now, because I kind of view Windows Subsystem for Linux and the Windows side as kind of two sides of the same machine, I didn't want to have one working directory for the Linux side and one working directory for the Windows side. This makes it really easy to edit files, open things up from the Windows side just by browsing to that directory. Now, there is a way that you're supposed to do this. So if you do have kind of the two file systems separate and never the two shall cross, you have that WSL $UNC share that you can use to get to those files from the Windows side. These files do actually exist on disk. You can see them, but if you go messing with them directly on the NTFS disk, bad things happen, or so I'm told. I don't want to try that. I don't want to experience that firsthand. But this setup has worked for me, and it's what I've been using since basically the beginning of the year. So I don't see any reason to change it. If I run into an issue, maybe I will. But for now, this is what I work with. So let's cd into working, because it is a directory, and I'm not going to ls it because there are some projects there that I don't necessarily want to share with the world quite yet. But I am going to point out a couple of them. The biggest one, actually, the main reason that I use Windows Subsystem for Linux is to run Ruby and Mongo. I don't remember if I showed this in a previous video, but I actually do have a MongoDB running in Windows Subsystem for Linux. This is kind of weird, so there are some things to watch out for here. MongoDB in Windows Subsystem for Linux doesn't automatically start up when your computer starts up. And that's because Windows Subsystem for Linux is kind of in this halfway in between state where it's kind of a VM, but also kind of not a VM. So when I reboot my machine, or when my machine installs updates and reboots on its own, this Windows Subsystem for Linux VM doesn't automatically come back up. Windows Subsystem for Linux starts up as soon as you need it. So as soon as I pull up this shell in Windows Terminal, that's when I get this Windows Subsystem for Linux VM spun up. But it also doesn't go through the normal init process that a full Linux VM would. So it doesn't start up all the services that are installed, Mongo included. So if I want to start Mongo so I can work with it, I actually do have to sudo etc init.d Mongo. I guess it's just start because it hasn't been started. So I do need to run that command in order to start MongoDB. It also, even though this is a relatively new Ubuntu, it does have systemd installed. I can't use system control because systemd isn't actually running. Because this isn't really a full Linux installation, it doesn't really have systemd. Systemd is installed, but it's not running, and that's not really what it's using for all the init infrastructure. So you do need to go through the old school way, sudo etc initd MongoDB start. So that's the first thing that I use Windows Subsystem for Linux for, is to run MongoDB, or specifically services that I don't want to either spend the time installing on the Windows side, or they really work better when they're installed in Linux. So I did try to install RabbitMQ in WSL at one point. There is a problem that prevents RabbitMQ from actually working in WSL, so I couldn't do that. I actually had to go off to I have another Linux machine around here that I had to install it in for that video. That's on my other channel. I will leave a link to that one. That one's actually kind of cool. At some point, I might install Redis and see if that works. But that's, those programs, yes, they do have Windows installers, but they're not really, they're kind of hacked together. They're not quite as polished as they are on Linux. They behave very well on Linux. I'm more familiar with them on Linux. They feel much more comfortable to me because they've started their life on the Linux side. So since I have Windows Subsystem for Linux, it makes sense for me just to use what to them basically looks like a real Linux. So that's the first reason. The second thing I use WSL for is primarily static site generators. So, and I said Ruby before. The popular static site generator is Jekyll, and that's a Ruby app. I really didn't want to install a Ruby runtime on Windows and deal with all that because I am not a Ruby developer. The only thing I use Ruby for is Jekyll because it is the most mature of all of them. But it's really easy on the Linux side. So I just installed Jekyll, and I think it was just like a sudo apt install Jekyll or something like that. So then I go into the directory for that website, and it's just a Jekyll site, and you can see the permissions look kind of weird again because this is on the Windows side. Then I do my editing in Visual Studio Code, and if I type code dot in Windows Terminal, it does the right thing. It'll open up Visual Studio Code, and it'll show my site. Again, it's just a static site generated site, so there's nothing fancy here. It will connect to WSL, and I can edit here. I can even run a terminal, which when it loads, this will actually be the WSL terminal. So that's great. So I can just type, Jekyll serve, and it'll spin up the site and serve it on whatever the default port is. And that's fantastic. That leaves me free to do whatever I need to in this terminal. And I can go over to the site for my other company, which is not a Jekyll site. It is a Hugo site. At the time, for one reason or another, I didn't want to use Jekyll. I found a alternative to Jekyll written in Go called Hugo. So I can do the same thing here. I can, Hugo serve. Normally what I do is I open it up in Visual Studio Code, and then from that terminal, that's where I run Hugo serve to serve it up while I'm editing. Both of those have kind of watchers, auto reload. So as I edit the pages, it automatically reloads what I'm seeing in the browser. Really cool. Obviously, I run the browser on the Windows side. I just use Edge. I switched from Chrome to Edge back when they actually finally released the the Chromium-based Edge, and I found it to be really awesome. I don't use it because it's Microsoft's browser. I use it because it works really well. At that point in time, that iteration of Chrome had some issue that I ran into, so I switched over to Edge, and I just haven't switched back. So those are the two main reasons that I use Windows Subsystem for Linux. That's getting really difficult to say. Windows Subsystem for Linux. WSL. Those are the two reasons that I use WSL. One is to install Linuxy services that I want to use, and the other one is to run applications that run really well in Linux. That might require a significant runtime that's a little bit more difficult to install on Windows, install, configure, that sort of thing. Again, I didn't want to deal with a Ruby runtime. I didn't want to deal with a Go runtime, though of course I did in that other video where I tested out Go and learned some, beefed up on my knowledge of Go. But it works really well, having the files basically over in the Linux side, running those static site generators on the Linux side, and then editing on the Windows side in Visual Studio Code. Now, this was prompted by a couple videos that I did with PHP in Windows Subsystem for Linux, and I am more and more a C# developer. I'm really happy with what Microsoft has done with .NET Core and how cross-platform it is. I develop on Windows and then I publish to Linux, and I don't have to worry about any issues. It's so far it's worked flawlessly. Knock on wood. Hopefully it continues to work flawlessly. But prior to that, I did a lot of stuff in PHP. PHP was free. PHP was cross-platform. I was mostly Mac and Linux, so that worked really well. PHP, it does run on Windows, but there are a few extra hoops that you have to jump through. But with all the stuff that I've learned while doing all those videos of running PHP in Windows Subsystem for Linux, I might very well dust off some of the PHP apps that I've built in the past, clean them up, maybe add some CI pipelines to them, because a lot of them are before I started really getting into DevOps and CI/CD and that sort of thing. And kind of get a feel for how that all works. And I might even capture some of it on camera. So stay tuned for those. Yeah, I'm really excited about WSL now that I know how it's supposed to work, now that I know how it works, and now that I've built it into my workflow. I think it's a really cool tool, and I hope you try it out and test it out, see how it works for you, see what you think. If you have any questions at all, leave a comment below. And of course, like this video if you found the content useful. Subscribe to the channel for this, for more content like this. Again, lots of ways to go here. If you have a specific topic that you have in mind that you'd love to hear me talk about or demo, go ahead and leave a comment below, and I'll let you know. When it's slated. Send me an email if you don't want to leave a comment below. I'll leave my email address down in the video description. And of course, subscribe, ring the bell so you'll be notified. Share this video far and wide. WSL is a great tool, but I still see lots of people on Windows not using it. And I'm not sure if that's because they just haven't found a use for it yet, or because they don't know it exists. And in either case, I think this video showed a bunch of different ways that I found A, justify using WSL, and B, show that WSL is actually a great tool for accomplishing some of those things. So with that, I'm going to end the video. Have a great Thursday and a great rest of your week, and I'll see you again, well, probably Sunday, but at least next week. Later.